Hidden in the depths of the mind is a secret tomb where knowledge, fear, mystery, and a macabre sense of enjoyment is held. Each corner is resplendent with its own curiosities, and each curiosity appeals to a different soul. You're listening to The Crypt of the Unknown, a podcast that discusses the realms of the horrific and the fantastic in print, games, or on the screen. And now, introducing you to the Guardians of the Crypt, your tour guides. Here are Webb and Stefan J.D.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Crypt of the Unknown. I am going to be the one starting this off right here because I'm going to be asking my co-host questions this episode, the critical android, Webb. Webb, how are you doing today?
I am doing pretty well, all things considered. How are you doing, my friend?
I am feeling awesome. It has been a second since we've recorded anything, and I feel great to be chatting with you again. Although, as you know, it's not going to be the most hip subject of all. And this was your idea, Webb, which I thought it was a great idea. I hope people are really interested in listening to this. I don't even know what you're going to say because I'm asking these questions and I don't know the answers. So I'll be learning along with everyone listening. We're going to be talking about the Craigslist Killer, whose name was Philip Haynes Markoff, translated to Philip Haynes Chekhov in Russian, and also in a Sam Raimi way, roughly translated to Book of the Dead.
I very much question the factual accuracy of those things.
I Wikipedia'd them, so they should be 100% factual.
Oh, well, in that case, I take back my questions.
So, Philip Haynes Markoff is known as the Craigslist Killer. He was born in Sherrill, New York in 1986, and he died of suicide in Boston, Massachusetts, in August 15th of 2010 of suicide. And his occupation, get this, medical student. Now, Webb, please fill us all in of your first encounter of actually meeting the Craigslist Killer and how that took place.
Well, as you mentioned, he was born in Sherrill, New York, and I was born in upstate New York, not in Sherrill, but in a city close by, and we went to the same high school together. Now, the thing about upstate New York is that when people think of New York, a lot of people just think about the city. They think New York City. Totally understandable. It's such a major cultural, figure point that you can't shake the image of New York City when you think of New York. But in truth, the state of New York is pretty large. It is larger in landmass than Ireland and Northern Ireland combined. And there's so much of it that it's just these backwater towns, these out-of-the-way areas that are mostly farmland. There's some smaller cities and some larger ones, not quite the scale of New York City, but you have things like Albany, Buffalo, which are pretty big, and then smaller cities like Utica, Oneida. And in this case, Sherrill is a wealthier city, small, very small city. Most people would, from bigger cities, would look at it and be like, the hell is this, backwater town? And
I'm guessing it's right next to Isengard, then? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it's right next to Isengard. Correct. You see hobbits coming and going all the time. But no, in this case, Sherrill is interesting in that it's a wealthier neighborhood, largely because it was, for quite some time, the home for the Oneida Silverware factory. For those of you who know anything about silverware, Oneida Silverware was like the top of the line that was used worldwide for decades. And the plant went under in the early 2000s, largely thanks to just shifting dynamics, manufacturing jobs leaving the country, and also because of 9/11. Because one of the big contracts that Oneida Limited had was with airlines. And guess what you couldn't take onto airlines anymore after 9/11?
Dildos?
And metal silverware, both of which
Yes.
were manufactured in Sherrill. No, just the silverware.
I say dildos. It's a Fight Club joke, if anyone remembers, because, it vibrates. They think it's a bomb. Blah, blah, blah. Go on.
So, the city still remained, and still is, the higher money-making demographic in the area. Like, if there's wealth to be had in that area, it's at Sherrill. So it kind of stands out as, what would kind of be, how major cities have their suburbs?
Of course, yeah.
Well, imagine if Sherrill was, instead of the suburb, it was the city, but it just had the suburb. So there was, no city to back it up in terms of, a cultural high point. It was just this place surrounded by, rednecks and people who are very salt-of-the-earth people. Not to say that a lot of them are bad people, but they are very regressed in terms of culture, society. Still very good people, but you can see, with voting demographics, how heavily it skews conservative Republican, despite the fact that, it's in New York, but it's a very conservative area.
That makes a lot of sense. That's a good way to explain it.
So this place is unique in that you have people from Sherrill who are kind of different enough from the people around because they come from a bit more of wealth and they're not like farmers or, just people living out in the open like so much of the surrounding area is. But it still is this kind of isolated little patch of society that almost exists as a land out of a land. For example, remember when this made huge news back in, the mid-2000s, I think it was around 2003. I think it was the summer of 2003. Remember when they had the big Northeast blackout?
Mm-hmm.
Sherrill had its own power grid. So you could see this little part of New York State that was lit up, and that was Sherrill, New York, because of how separate it was from the rest of society. So it's not like some oasis in the desert. It's just kind of like a little bit of an upgraded desert surrounded by more desert compared to what it could be.
Gotcha.
But it's still different enough culturally. And that's the kind of environment that Phil grew up in, this kind of a different little piece of that area that had enough of a divide to where you could kind of tell when people were from Sherrill as opposed to the other places that were in the area that went to the same high school. Phil went to VVS, Vernon Verona Sherrill High School. And Vernon Verona were very much those kind of, backwoods towns. Sherrill was not. So there's a sharp cultural divide between the Sherrill people and the Vernon Verona people. Did it affect how people went to school and whatnot? Kind of. I'm sure there were some people who were being bullied for being poor. But Phil was still a nice guy in the sense of, I got along with him very well. We ate lunch together every day for the better part of 2, almost 3 years because of the way our lunch periods were. And we also talked a lot on AOL Instant Messenger because that was the big thing for our area was Instant Messenger.
Mm-hmm.
And we would talk a lot about politics and just general things that are going on in the area. So, yeah, I was good. I was a pretty good friend with Phil for about 3 years before we went off to college.
I guess I want to channel it back a little bit to the fact that, you say you guys talked about politics and how Sherrill might have leaned more conservative, whereas we all know New York City is kind of like a blue, rolls blue, we should say. But you were at one point a conservative, so I'm guessing those conversations had to loom around the Bush presidency and what was going on around then?
Yes, 100%. We were both pretty heavily conservative. And that tied into everything from when the Bush election was happening. It was still election day for a while there as they were counting and recounting votes in Florida. And we were both expressing our desire to see Bush win. And then, with the war in Iraq, when that was starting up, there was still our positive sentiment about that, wanting to see the weapons of mass destruction that obviously amounted to nothing, but wanting to see those be uncovered, see Hussein be taken down. There was a lot that we had to discuss in that, as well as more kind of social commentary at the time about the social end of politics when it comes to things like abortion and gay marriage and drug legislation, all that stuff. So there were a lot of discussions that were had about the more heavily conservative politics of the time. So, yeah, those were talking points that we had frequently.
the big thing too is because you said you guys hung out every day at lunch and everything. Do you actually remember the first time you guys like spoke to one another and how that happened, or is it kind of just all blurred in your head together as one?
It kind of just blurred together in the sense of we had some crossover between circle of friends like Josh, and I'll leave out last names, but there was crossover between a lot of us. And because of all of those things, when Phil was, like, how do I want to put this? When Phil was basically around and about, like, he gravitated over towards the lunch table where we were sitting at. And so because of that mutualness, he just kind of was there with the conversation. And I don't want to say that Phil was, like, on the periphery of it, because we didn't, like, ignore him, or he wasn't, like, not actively involved. But you know how sometimes when friends get together, there's always, like, one or two who are kind of like the leaders of the conversations. Like, they tend to exert more of a personality into things.
Yeah, there's more of a... Well, I mean, they call it, like, the alpha male mentality. Like, there's the ones who kind of lead the group, you know, and they're the loudest, and then there's the other ones who fall in line is, like, there's the joker, there's the quiet one, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Phil, I don't want to say he was the quiet one, because he wasn't like that stereotypical quiet one. But he just was more like there and present, but he wasn't the person who propelled the conversations forward. That would have been like my friend Jason, who was good at that, or sometimes myself. Mm-hmm. That's where a lot of that came from. Phil wasn't one of those people, but he was still there and present. And I never got, the vibe from him that he would go on to do the things that he did, which I guess before we go forward, I think I'd like to talk about what he actually did. I'd like to, because I think what other questions did you have first? I mean, we'll do that first.
So with Phil, like, did you notice anything, obviously? Like, was he a very neat person? Was he able to joke at all? Or was he more of like I'm trying to fit in? I mean, what, because it boils down to the fact that, when you hear about, like, people who've killed other people, or just serial killers in general, they usually have, like, a very tidy workspace. They're always very trying to fit in and be conformative and show some point of empathy when they usually don't have any. So I'm just curious if Phil came off with any of those check marks when you knew him.
Not a one. Not wow. One of them.
Okay.
He was a bit nerdy, geeky, and gangly in terms of his appearance, but he wasn't like unkempt. He wasn't like a neat freak or anything. He didn't display any of those kind of tendencies that you would see from somebody who would turn out to do what he did. He was just very much he wasn't that kind of socially anxious person, or that individual who doesn't blend well with the situation. He was just kind of, like I said, he was involved in conversations, and he wasn't unwanted. He wasn't an unwanted presence. He wasn't somebody who's just like, oh, Jesus, it's that Phil guy again. Nothing like that. He was just there. He was there for the conversations. He was there to discuss things, and he wasn't a bad person at all when it came to any of that. He was just a good guy who may not have added an awful lot to conversation, but, when he was there, he contributed. So it didn't give any kind of an inclination that he would do what he did.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all very surprising. I mean, it's not like we can deduce every serial killer or just people who have committed murder into a little box, because at the end of the day, and this is a real fact, that they say that in your whole lifetime, you actually will, at some point, walk by around 10 different serial killers during your whole lifetime, give or take, on average. So I guess in this way, you just got a little bit closer than most people, which is okay because you're safe and so is everyone else. Sadly, Phil is, after what he's done, which we're right about to get into, he's committed suicide. So anyway, what Phil did This first one, the first charge, and again, he was a medical student, is with the armed robbery and murder of Jalissa Brisman in a Boston hotel on August 14th of 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And Jalissa Brisman. So Jalissa Brisman had posted an advertisement online. She was offering massage services, and she was found dead April 14th, 2009 at the Copley Marriott in Boston. When you heard this news, Webb, what was going through your head?
Well, it's kind of funny because I had been hearing in the news mostly through reading things online. I guess at the time that this was happening, 2009 to 2010, I was so burnt out from news media because I was a politics major in college. And I was so burnt out from all of politics, I could not watch the news. I could not stomach it, could not handle it. So I would just peruse through the internet for major news updates and like on the yahoo.com front page or stuff. And I see these things about the Craigslist Killer. And the murder of Jalissa was actually the second case that had happened, because before that, he had robbed an erotic masseuse, like had arranged things through Craigslist, met her up in a hotel room, robbed her, tied her up, and then, left her there, didn't kill her. And then there was the one where the woman, Jalissa, was killed. And then there was a third case, similar to the first, where bound her up, robbed her, and, didn't kill her. And I distinctly remember this. I'll never forget when I kind of like put it all together, because when I finally found out about it, it was when they, when they actually arrested him, and I saw the article. It's like Craigslist Killer found, and it's like Phil Markoff, and it's like, okay. And for some reason, my mind wasn't connecting it with the Phil Markoff. I know, I just saw the name there, but wasn't even reading it. Or in terms of like I wasn't reading it mentally. It was just kind of there on the page. But what triggered it was when I read Cheryl, New York. And when I read Cheryl, New York, it's like, wait a second, Cheryl, New York. And then I read the name again, Phil Mark. Oh my God, it's fucking Phil. And like it all just like everything just kind of collapsed into one moment when I read that. And I was like, holy shit. And I immediately started reaching out to friends who knew Phil, and all of us were just stunned. And then that's where I heard from people who were still living in Cheryl about the news trucks that were coming by, the news vans everywhere parked outside of people's places. And I had friends who were being contacted by news agencies who still were like looking at Phil's like AOL Instant Messenger list, and were able to see people who were listed on it and started contacting them. And I had, at that point in time, I hadn't really talked with Phil for a few years because college just made us go separate ways. So I never got to contact him myself. But a lot of people were just absolutely flabbergasted by this. I mean, this is a guy who would, play, who bowl at the local bowling alley and, play ball in the backyards of people. So this is not someone who you would have expected to be a murderer. And that, let alone one that makes national headlines with a name, like a title, like the Craigslist Killer. So for that to happen like that, and for it all to just kind of like dawn on me all at once, was just like, wow, that is, you just, that saying when people have like how time slows down and like you just, everything just kind of doesn't feel real. It was like that for like a minute or two. And then it's just like, holy shit. And then I just had to bounce back from there and realize that this was real, and that the Phil that I knew turned out to be the Craigslist Killer.
Which is crazy to me. And the reason why I brought up Jalissa Brisman first before Trisha Leffler is because, and this is, I mean, they're all kind of like in the same realm of doing something physical with somebody. I mean, Corrine Stout was an exotic dancer. Trisha was an escort. Jalissa was a massage service. Doesn't mean she was sexual in any way. But these were all things that were connected loosely. They all happened within days of one another. The reason the police put this together was apparently through security footage and, basically every single way they can deduce and put together the duct tape that is the evidence against you today. But and the thing about Phil, and I'm not sure if you continued to watch the news, but it obviously is that he did not plead guilty. He said, not guilty. I didn't do any of this. His fiancée, who I don't know if you knew.
No. He met Megan after we weren't in contact anymore, so I never got to know who Megan was. But, if there's another victim in all of this besides Jalissa and the other two women who were assaulted, the third victim or the fourth victim in this has to be Megan.
Yeah.
My heart goes out to her as it does to everybody who was affected by this, in the sense of, I don't know how you go on from something like that having a trust in another human being again. I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah, and this is definitely, because we've talked about this before during Batman the Cult, a thing called cognitive dissonance. I don't think, obviously, Megan was suffering from that at all. I don't think that was part of the reason why she initially, had the belief that he was innocent. It's just, she was engaged to this guy, and she's like, there's no way,
right.
But in the flip side of things, obviously, they were not married. Phil went to jail, and she visited him a couple times. Then she said, I can't do this, and Phil committed suicide.
The evidence against him was incredibly damning. I mean, this is not one of those cases of, we'll never know. Because, no, we know. There were clear pictures of him there in the vicinity. There's cell phone data because he used his cell phone while he was there. It's very much clear that he did it. The thing that, I find interesting about it all is that when people are talking about the case, they don't have an answer as to why he did it. And I think I very much know why he did it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. See, there's a lot of things that factor into this. And this is what makes it complicated, because I think with some people, in some cases, you have that very clear reason as to why someone did something, whether it be an act of revenge or for the money, or one of those simple reasons where you hear people do heinous things. And you wonder what makes it so that that person resorts to violence as opposed to another person. Like, for instance, I know there's times where you and I have been tight on money. We didn't go and, rob an erotic masseuse for it and then, threaten to kill her. So what separates people from, the people who will commit a violent act to the people who don't? And that's another question for another time, but at the same time, it kind of ties into what we're talking about here. I think, and I know this from Phil, there's two things about him that I know that maybe other people don't as to what would contribute to this. Actually, three things. One of them is what I mentioned about the kind of environment that Cheryl and upstate New York is. It's a very kind of a backwards town, not a lot of cultural diversity, not a lot of intellectual diversity, and it breeds the kind of ignorance that you see when people are not exposed to the rest of the world. And I think that's kind of environment that causes things like sexual repression. And for those of you who don't know what sexual repression is, humans are made to be, for the most part, as all animals are largely, sexual creatures. Like, there's that part of the body that is made for reproducing. And, that may not be the case for everybody. There's obviously people who are asexual or whatnot. But, if there is one point of life, or a reason why life was created, life is catered towards the idea of continuing itself. That's why life apparently may exist from a biological evolutionary standpoint. Life exists to propagate. So there's a part of all of us, whether it's realized or not, that is geared towards being a sexual creature. And getting in touch with that sexuality, or lack thereof, if a person is asexual or not, is a vital part of growth. And this is why you have people who are transgendered or gay, who will go through immense psychological problems because if they can't open themselves up and be who they are, it creates an immense amount of internal conflict. You may very well know somebody yourself who had problems trying to come out of the closet or feels like they're born the wrong gender, and it tears them up inside.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know several people who have gone through that kind of trauma, and it hurts to see that. It always hurts to see somebody suffering because they can't be who they want to be. And this is something that unfortunately happens in conservative places that frown upon sex. And when they teach things like abstinence-only education, you have people who develop severe feelings of sexual repression. And I believe that that's part of what Phil was up against, combined with that conservative mentality. Because the other part of that conservative mentality is very law and order, which can cause you to look down on certain people like drug users or sex workers or just people who seem to have a different moral agenda than you do, whether it's like women who have abortions. Conservatives might look down on them. I know this is a very hot-button topic, and not all conservatives are like that. But I can tell you this, when I was younger, I looked down upon a lot of people who I felt I had moral superiority to because I wasn't a sex worker, I wasn't a drug addict. But as I got older, I realized that, well, some people who do the sex work just do it either because, you know, they need the money, they enjoy doing it, they're sex positive in terms of being very...
promiscuous?
Well, not just promiscuous, but they want to promote sex positivity and how that's just part of the human experience. And I don't have a right to judge them. I did before, but I don't have a right to judge them. And when I woke up to that fact and, it dawned on me how terrible I was being, I look back on a lot of things and I regret it. Seriously regret. There's a lot of changing that I've done over time to embrace other people. And there's still a lot of changes that, I feel like I could still continue to push myself to be better in understanding other people and acting better towards others when it comes to walks of life or trying to be more compassionate. I think there's always room for growth in that stuff, and that's not a bad thing to acknowledge that and try to push.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, I think it's people who are complacent in thinking that they know their feelings and they're superior about it and don't develop any change, are just the people who later on become assholes. Because you should always be willing to sacrifice complacency for growth. If you're not doing that, you're gonna end up an asshole, or some part of you is going to be stuck in an age that will no longer belong to you in the future, and is never something you want to boil yourself down into.
I fully agree, and I think we all share a burden of, we can look out back in the past on people who we've mistreated, whether it was intentionally or unintentionally, and the best of us realize that, that was wrong, and we wish we could, go back in time and stop those things.
Mm-hmm.
Very easily can happen, and I know that was easily the case for me, where if I could go back and look at the people who my thought process and my actions hurt, I wish I could fix those things. But I don't think Phil ever got to that point. I think that conservative mindset that he had continued to make him look down on certain groups of people. And I don't know if he was looking down on women in general, but I do know that based off of his conservative politics and the discussions that we had, that when it came to people like sex workers, for example, definitely looked down on them. And there's another thing that I distinctly remember about Phil that kind of leads into this, is that there was a girl who I distinctly remember he had a crush on or affections for, and he wanted to ask her out. And one of his other friends, who may well have known that he had affections for this girl, asked her out instead and started dating her.
Yo.
Yeah, and Phil was not happy about that, and he was expressing that to me through Instant Messenger at the time. And at one point, when he was voicing his frustrations, he thought he wanted to try to get a small act of revenge against him. And he tried messaging him on Messenger about it all, and I can't remember if he blocked him or if he just stopped bothering him. But he thought it would be, I guess, a bit of way of like creeping him out and stuff if he started making other AOL Instant Messenger accounts and started randomly messaging from them. And I remember thinking at the time that if Phil wanted to do that, then at least he wasn't physically hurting the guy or confronting him face to face. But I don't remember actually endorsing the idea.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if he ever went through with it. But I do know that's one of the things he wanted to do was just make a bunch of dummy accounts, just like spam him with messages and bother him, and kind of freak him out a little bit, maybe give him a scare or a jolt. So I think, however, though, that part of the problem wasn't that he was entirely angry at the other guy. I think he was also partially angry at the girl in question because she chose the other guy over Phil.
Well, see, and that can be like the toughest thing in the world. I've personally have been in the opposite position with Phil's case, where I was
you were the girl, and okay.
Yeah,
no, I went the wrong way with that one.
I was the guy who asked here's what happened. I know how he feels. I'll just put it that way. But I think in the case of that, if anyone ever goes through that, please don't rob and murder people. But it's a part of life. I think for this, because what you're telling me, Webb, and what I'm getting from it, is that a lot of his urges were very much repressed, and the one few things that you know about that he wanted to go out and tackle, those were also taken away from him, and it kind of starting to feel like every instance that you know of, he felt some sort of burden. For a kid going to medical school, that seems like a lot, because I know medical school is one tough-ass place to be when you need to study your ass off and be on your A game every single day.
I think he carried around with him some very deep resentments towards women in general. And I think his fiancée, Megan, was probably the one exception to that, where he felt like, well, here's a woman who gets me. And I don't know what his dating life was like after college, or once college started, or after graduation from high school. But I wouldn't be surprised if Megan turned out to be like one of the first girls that really showed him a lot of affection. I don't know if it was his first like really serious relationship or not. I don't know. But I do feel like he probably worshipped her to, I don't want to say an unhealthy extent. Possibly. I don't want to speculate on that because I want to comment on things that I know as opposed to things that I'm speculating on.
Yeah, people should keep that in mind, that we're only basing this off of what Webb knows. We're not going to spout misinformation on purpose just to get people to listen.
Right. But I would not be surprised if it turns out that was one of the first serious relationships he had based off what I knew of him from high school. Because he was not suave in high school. He was not really, like, smooth and sophisticated like that. He was kind of nerdy and geeky.
I thought that was smooth and sophisticated.
Well, maybe it is now.
Messing up this whole time.
But no, he. I think that she may have been like the one exception to that, and what I think is coming together is a combination of these conservative ideals, wanting to take control over something in his life, and I think Megan may have been too special to him for him to want to like try to control or hurt her because of the way that he, appreciated and worshipped her, how important she was. It's like some people, when they want to control a situation, they turn to domestic abuse.
That is a lot of cases.
Yeah, a lot of cases that happens. Like, there's that one person in their life they want to control, and so they do so. But I don't think Phil had the heart to do that to the woman that he loved. So I think his way of exerting this kind of control, combining with a conservative ideology, his demonizing of people who were beneath him, so to say, these call girls or these sex workers were the perfect target for that. This is why, like when people talk about the motive, they talk about, well, he had gambling debts, maybe. But if he had gambling debts and that was his motivation, then why did he take their panties when he robbed them? The panties were a trophy. And generally when you take trophies, it's because you're exerting power over something, and that trophy is a testament to that power, to that thrill, whatever it was that you got from it.
Remembrance or recall back to how great that feeling was.
Exactly. So that's why I feel like this was motivated by a power fantasy of having this control over another person's life, and somebody who was beneath him. Like, these sex workers were beneath him, and that's why he did it. As opposed to these other theories that go out there. I don't know if this was like a sexual high for him, because you do hear cases of people who have like some sort of sexual experience with these things that they do, whether it be sexual release from murder or seeing death or being around it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that was the case with Phil. Given sexual repression, like getting to like a fever pitch, maybe he had latent desires he couldn't fulfill with Megan. I don't know. Again, that's pure speculation. But when it comes to the targeting and like taking the trophies from this women, it had to be something more than money. And if there's one thing that's more important than money to some people, it's power. And I really think that's what he was going for. I believe that he truly did love his fiancée, based off what I know of Phil, because I'd like to say that he was not a bad guy. But I think there were elements at play within his mind that made him do some really bad things. And this is furthered by the way that he went about these robberies, where the reason why he killed that poor girl was because she was trying to escape, and he couldn't have that. So he panicked and killed her.
Yeah.
If she hadn't tried to escape, then she probably would have, wound up like the first victim, the third victim, alive. But I mean, I'm not trying to blame her for escaping or trying to escape. No, not saying that.
In that situation, honestly, all of them probably felt like they were going to die.
Oh, of course.
I mean,
yeah, you do what you have to do to survive.
Yeah, and fight or flee, and then that first girl, the first initial one, I think it was April 10th, she was gagged and tied up. So at that point, you gotta have in your head, okay, I'm gonna die. Like, thankfully she didn't, but at that point in my head, I would have been like, okay, that's it. Like, there's nothing else I can do. I could try and fight and struggle, which I'm sure all of them did. But yeah, at that point, that would be in my head. So the fact that the second girl did get away in some capacity to almost escaping, I feel very bad for her, because I wish in a different parallel universe, which is impossible, that she had known that possibly she wasn't going to be killed.
Yeah.
Given the circumstances, the other two.
And her and her family, I mean...
Of course.
When I say that, Phil wasn't a bad guy, I in no way mean that as a slap in the face to what he did to his victims.
Right. There
are people who are capable of great acts of good and great acts of evil. And determining whether or not somebody was good or bad it should hinge on, normally for most people, it hinges on the totality of events. People are flawed, they can do bad things, and bad people can do good things. But how do you judge whether a person is good or bad? In this case, what Phil did was incredibly heinous. Because, again, sometimes it's easier to do bad things to people when you're not viewing them as people. It's why the military does a great job, and has done over the centuries, of demonizing their victims, or the enemy, I should say. It's why they give nicknames to people or to opposing armies. Because when you're reducing them to a name, like a nickname, or to a group, it's easier to kill somebody than it is face to face. When you're actually facing the humanity of it.
Exactly. I was just about to say, it's the humanity of the whole thing. It makes it less real almost.
And for Phil, I think that's how he was able to do this, because he didn't view these women as fully, like, I guess, acknowledged people. He viewed them as sex workers who weren't, a legitimate part of society, so to say. And that is, I think that's why he was able to do this. I wonder if he hadn't got caught, how long he would have continued to do it, especially after having killed one of them. If he was just successfully robbing them and not having to kill anybody, maybe he would have continued doing it because to him they weren't like victims. But I think it'd have to be eventually that knowing that he caused the death of somebody, it would have caught up to him. I'd like to think that would be the case.
Yeah.
Can't say for sure. All we know now is that either because of the court case or because of Megan leaving him because she knew the evidence was so clear that Phil had done this. I mean, they found the zip ties in his room that he used to tie these women up and bind them. They found a hollowed-out copy of Grey's Anatomy with a gun inside of it. I mean, and that just goes to show that he was trying to be smart and methodical about this in like a kind of like a cool or clever way. Because, you know, obviously the irony of that is like, I'm a doctor, I'm going to use Grey's Anatomy for this.
Right. I was just about to say something, but I was like, is it appropriate?
I mean, when somebody's doing that, it's because they're taking some sort of pride in what they're doing. So, again, this ties into the power fantasy. Like, you know, putting that gun inside Grey's Anatomy, he fully knew the imagery and the meaning tucked behind an act like that. He wasn't stupid.
He had thought about this in more than one ways.
Yeah, and that's also why when he bound these women, he had taken their cell phones and then tried to delete his contact information from them. Because he was just trying to be smart about it. He didn't think of it through all the way, obviously. Like, you know, not wearing a fucking disguise to go and do this, or wearing a mask or something. He didn't take an awful lot of pains to hide his appearance. So because of all those things, he ended up being caught, and all led back to him. And Megan, being the intelligent person that she apparently is, knew that this wasn't something that you could, like, you know, do, like you said, cognitive dissonance. It's not something that you could just reject the reality of and place something of your own. She knew that Phil had done it and left him, and he couldn't take it, and committed suicide.
And I'm not trying to make a pamphlet or how-to book for this too, but another thing he did that was obviously a complete mistake is these are all linked in the same week, or stretch of 7 days, I should say. But you don't do that, and sure enough, I mean, the statistics are high on what happens to sexual workers, and you know, lots of atrocious people are looking for those specific types of people in that line of work to create terrible pain to. And in the case of Phil, not only did he do that, but he did it so closely linked and at hotels. Very, very obvious that these were all of the same work by the same person. And the way that they looked at the phone history and his emails and, like you said, the stuff he had with him, it was just a clear case of man, okay, we got the guy. And that it's sad because I look back on this and I read it, and I see, like, the things he did when he committed suicide in his jail cell and, you know, putting Megan's name and their pet's name, apparently, on the wall in his blood, and the way he cut himself, given the fact that he went to medical school. I mean, he knew what he was doing then, just as he knew what he was doing when he committed the crimes. So, any sympathy for me, not knowing him, I don't have any. I'm sure in respect to the people that these terrible things that happen to them, I know that your only sympathy, Webb, I'm going to guess, is that the fact that, you know, you probably could wish you were there to help him out. You know,
the sympathy is a hard thing to have when people do heinous things. And you wonder, like, where does that line get drawn between a good person and a bad person as to what somebody does? Like, for example, you can have people who beat their kids, so to say, which is heinous. And then you can have people who drive drunk and endanger the lives of others. But who's worse, a drunk driver or a child abuser? I mean, when you think about things like that and the scale of morality, where do you draw that line? We pick and choose where we draw the line on things. Again, when you think about, like, I know many people, dear friends, who have driven drunk. Some people listening to this podcast maybe have been guilty of that. And then you think about, well, you could have fucking killed somebody. Like, you easily could have killed somebody. Does that ever sit on your conscience that you could have done that? And for the most part, I don't think it does for a lot of people, unless it actually happens. So, I mean, are you some kind of a monster for doing that? Do you deserve sympathy for what you've done for driving drunk and possibly endangering the lives of others? Like, it sounds so demanding and demeaning, and like you're condemning people for what they've done. So when it comes to sympathy for things, the only thing that you can do is try to have sympathy for people who recognize what they've done wrong and then want to try to improve upon it. And maybe I would have more sympathy for Phil as a person if he had owned up to what he did wrong, said that he needed help, and he wanted to try to make amends in any way, shape, or form, whether it be financially or ethically, some way to try to make up for what he had done to people. And obviously you can't make up for the loss of somebody's life. Money doesn't, bring a person back to life when you kill them.
Right, but maybe pleading guilty to taking that life could be one giant step in that direction.
Yeah, admitting that, you're the one who did it, to give the family some fucking closure. Do something like that to, own up to it, and then, tell them that you were wrong and that you did it and you take responsibility for it. I mean, that's one thing towards getting to that point.
Right.
I might have sympathy for Phil if he had done anything like that, but the taking of his own life and not willing to face his actions, that doesn't do anything. And even if he did it because he felt guilty over what he had done, he owes those families. He owed those families something, an admission of guilt, telling them that he was wrong and that he doesn't want to live with what he's done. But as penance for what he's done, he's going to live with it and, do something. It's just such a complicated thing when you know somebody who seemed to be good, and you'd like to think that they are good, and then they do something heinous. It takes that black and white morality that we normally have when we look at a case, when we see somebody up on the stand and think that person's a murderer. But that person could have done so many other good things in their life. And then somewhere they went off the rails. Somewhere what good judgment they had and what good, caring, sound heart they have stopped beating for a period of time. Something happened that made them do something despicable. And how does that happen? This isn't the case of the Unabomber or something who was warped out of his mind for years and had isolated himself from other people. This isn't the case of a complete sociopath. This is somebody who was not a bad person for much of his life, and then somewhere along the line, the combination of influences that he had just made him look down on people to the point where he thought that he could do the things that he did. And it's that's one thing that I feel bad about and sad about. It's that potentially good people can fall and do such horrible things that affect the lives of others in a way that you can't take back and you can't make up for.
Yeah, you can't bring people back from the dead. You can't, honestly, even after committing a murder, you can't give any sort of closure to a family, even if he did, again, admit guilt, or he said, give me all the justice I deserve. I mean, it still wouldn't equate to taking a life or bringing a life back. There's just nothing you could do.
Even if he had just robbed the people, I mean, to give them back what he had taken and then some, and then apologize for what he had done. I mean, obviously, there's still the emotional and mental scarring that comes from being treated like that, bound and gagged. But at least you can make financial restitution because that person still has their life, and then use the money you have to help them pay for therapy, or just own up to the fact that you tell them, I was a horrible person to you. Do something to try to make that person's life better than what you left it because of what you did. But he didn't do any of that.
And it's sad. And I'm glad you actually shared this story because I think you had mentioned it once before to me. I don't think I put much thought into it at the time because, as you say, drinking and driving. I wasn't drinking and driving. I was drinking probably that night. And I do remember you mentioning it just like really quickly. Oh yeah, I think I knew the Craigslist Killer. I was like, oh, that's crazy, But at a late night hour with a lot of alcohol in you, how much stock can you put into anything other than going to sleep? But I'm glad you did bring this up. I'm glad we talked about it. I actually find it interesting because, again, as tragic as it is, how many people do you know that have met someone that they, got to know before they committed, as you said, a heinous crime?
Yeah, and especially because this is not one of those things where he was under the influence of drugs. It's not like somebody who's a drug addict who's out of their mind with problems of addiction, and then they go and do something terrible because their mind was in an altered state. We're talking about somebody who just killed somebody and robbed from other people and bound them and gagged them and made them terrified for their lives. It's just hard to wrap your head around what makes that person a good or a bad person. It's like if you think about somebody who donates to charity all the time and works in a soup kitchen, and then you find out that in their off time they kill animals or something.
They buy cats and put them in a sack and dump them in the river.
Something like that. I mean, what makes the person bad, or when does the bad outweigh the good? Obviously, taking the life of another human being is part of that, but where does what changes a person's mind into something that where they wouldn't think of doing something like that, to where they actually do something like that?
Yeah, the moral quandary of it all.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, and I just I feel bad for the people whose lives he negatively impacted in such invariable ways, whether it be the victims who have to live with the memory of being helplessly bound and gagged, and they have to deal with that, to the poor girl that he killed and will never be able to live another day of her life, to his ex-fiancée who I don't know if she developed trust issues from something like this. I certainly can't blame her if she did. But my heart goes out to all of them for what they've had to experience. And I don't say that I wish they could have known the Philip who I remember from high school, who wouldn't have done these things. I'm just sorry that they had to be exposed to the actions of somebody who took some sort of a terrible turn in their mental well-being to where they thought that it was perfectly okay to do this to people. And that's the harrowing experience they had to go through. It's not fair. It's not right to them. And as much as we talk about the criminals, it's the victims who ultimately deserve the sympathy. And for that sake, do you have all three of the victims' names?
Yes, I do.
Can we read them off?
Yeah. So the victims, the three names here, the first one was the escort lady who was bound and gagged and robbed at gunpoint on April 10th, 2009. That is Tricia Leffler. The second lady, who was actually the one who was murdered, Jalissa Brisman. All she was doing was massage services, and she was found dead on April 14th, 2009. And the third one, on April 16th, 2009, was Corinne Stout, who was an exotic dancer just offering lap dance services. Pretty simple, tempted stuff from all three of these ladies, and at no point whatsoever did they deserve any of this.
No, and that's why I wanted their names to be read off again, because ultimately they're the ones who their story continues in terms of their lives and what they have to experience and what they've gone through. And if there's sympathy to be had, it needs to be for them, not for Philip. Even though there was a good person in there at some point in time, and that good person just made some terrible decisions.
Right. And those terrible decisions didn't even get to pay for them, as he was originally indicted on first-degree murder, armed robbery, and a whole smattering of other charges. Sadly, he never got to fully see the dish that he was going to get served in court. The family's got no justice. There's nothing cool about that. But I hope everyone gathered some insight into, the Craigslist Killer, Phil Webb's relationship with him. And, if there was any way we could donate to these families, let us know. We will definitely do that. I don't think it's a possibility. Maybe they don't want to be reminded. Please don't contact them in the event.
No, don't. Please don't.
Do not contact them whatsoever. But if there's something you already do have knowledge of in any way or form for us to donate to them, then we will gladly do that. Otherwise, please do not contact these families. Let this rest as it is. But I hope everyone got some insight into this. Do you have anything else to say, Webb?
Just that if one of the people connected to the victims or one of the victims themselves is listening, and they have like a charity that they feel like deserves attention, I'd be happy to make a donation on their behalf for letting me talk. Well, I'm not like it. In a perfect world, I wish I could have asked for their permission to talk about this story. Obviously, my story with Phil is my own to tell, but it connects to the lives of these other people who may not want to be reminded of that. And so the fact that I'm telling this, I feel like it's inherently selfish to an extent. But I also think it's important to understand the dynamics of how and why I feel like he did this, especially when questions go unanswered. Like, why does a person do the terrible things they do? Well, I've given you my take on why I think that he did what he did. And if somebody's listening to this who was victimized by Phil, if you have a charity that you would like to see a donation go towards, let me know, because I would happily give a donation to a charity of your choice because I told this story and it may have brought up some terrible memories, and I would be happy to make a donation to whatever charity you'd like so that I can thank you in a sense for me sharing my side of things. And I'm sorry for anything that it may have been drudged up that has caused you pain if you are listening to this.
Yeah, and how would those people get in touch with you, Webb?
They can do so on my Gmail account, thecriticalandroid@gmail.com. I check that all the time, so that's probably the easiest way to go about it. Or if they want to find me on Twitter, it's @criticalandroid.
Yep, and if you want me to also make a donation, I will happily do that. You can find me at Cyberpunk Holiday on Instagram, so just hit us up and we will be there.
And this is not a topic that I normally like to go into. I want to say that one of the inspiration for why I'm talking about it is because I recently watched a video from That Chapter, which is a great true crime YouTube series. And one of the questions that his host Mike was asking was, why did Phil do the things that he did? Like, there wasn't a clear answer. And I thought, well, maybe some people would want to find out why it happened, and it's important to find out why they did, because some of the things that led to it, in my opinion, of what led to it, of terrible sexual repression, growing up in an isolated kind of community in which ideas and cultures are not readily exchanged, kind of a warped conservative ideology. Not saying that all conservatives are harboring resentment towards sex workers or something like that, but I do think it's important to understand that some mindsets look down on other people, and the more you start to look down on people, the less you observe them as people. So I think that is an important lesson to take away from this about how that impacts others. So that's what I want people to take away from this more than anything, is that the way you view other people sometimes can be so detrimental to your mindset that you start to demonize people as being less than human or not deserving of affection or attention. And it's wrong. It's just so fucking wrong. And I know we're all guilty of it at some times, whether it be political or in other social circumstances. We can look at people and think that group of people or that person is less than what they are. Even if it's like you think about the heads of a corporation, when you think of the rich versus the poor, well, those rich people still have families. And you can never let yourself get to the point where you think that you can start taking from their lives in some way just because you feel like they're less than human for who they are. It's easy to fall into those trappings. It's less easy to fall into those trappings and physically act on it in a way that takes from them. But it can still happen. If you let it happen, it can happen. And you can't let yourself get to that point. That's what happened with Phil. Heaven forbid it happened with somebody else I know.
Yeah, and I think the old saying goes is that evil or corruption takes over only when good men do nothing. And when we say good men, we mean women too, of course.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's you gotta try to, when people are expressing that kind of hate towards others, you have to step in. I'm not saying you can't have like your conservative politics about, whether it be tax brackets or your feelings on whether or not abortion should be legal.
Gun legislation.
Yeah. When you're talking about the legislative aspects of things, like, is that a state's right? Whatever. There's certain things that, okay, you can have your opinions on them, but when you start demonizing other people and you start pulling from their life, whether it be like in Phil's case, is trying to take money from them and trying to take away their power over their life. When you start doing things like that, you've fallen far too off track, to say the least.
Seek therapy, please, Jesus Christ. But yeah, I agree with everything you're saying, Webb. I'm glad we talked about this again, and I hope everyone, I don't want to say enjoyed listening to this, but I hope everyone, as you said, gained some insight. And hopefully, people comment below. Let us know if you think we handled this respectfully. I think we did a pretty significant job. Again, please do not, I'm going to say this again, do not contact any of the victims or their families. Do not do that. The donations are only if you already know a way, or if those people are somehow redirected to this and listen to this. But do not do that. For the sake of everything we've talked about, there's absolutely no reason to reburden them with this pain.
Yeah, but thank you all for listening. Stefan, thank you for facilitating this interview. I do appreciate that.
Yeah, I thought it was, again, this is just using this loosely, but a good idea and of a concept to talk about. But everyone, thanks for listening here at Crypt of the Unknown. Obviously, we will be back with some more stuff. There will actually be a big announcement soon. We're going to do a channel update. We'll have to put this before then, I guess. But
yes.
But yeah, thanks everyone for listening to Crypt of the Unknown, and we will talk to you later. Peace.